If you are listening to this right now, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is something I never imagined would happen to me. My own son, the boy I raised and gave everything to, sent me a message at 9 o'clock on a Friday night, telling me to stay away from his family. He said they wanted peace. He thought I was just a clueless old man who would quietly fade into the background. He had no idea that my simple one-word reply was the beginning of his absolute ruin. If you have ever been taken for granted by the people you love the most, hit the like button and tell me where you are listening from in the comments. Now let me tell you how a simple text message triggered the most ruthless lesson a father could ever teach. My phone vibrated on the mahogany desk. The screen illuminated the dark room. It was a text message from my son Derek. I picked it up and read the words slowly. "Dad, do not come to our house this weekend. Monica is stressed out. We want peace." I read those 3 sentences again. "Do not come to our house. We want peace." I did not call him. I did not scream or throw the phone against the wall. Instead, I walked over to my liquor cabinet. I poured myself a generous glass of aged bourbon. I took a slow sip, feeling the burn in my throat. I looked out the window of my Seattle home and smiled a very cold smile. I am Richard Lawson. I am 70 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life building commercial real estate in Seattle. I know the value of a dollar, and I know the true nature of people. But a father always has a blind spot for his children. My blind spot was Derek. The message on my phone was just the final nail in the coffin. The real trigger happened just 36 hours earlier. I had gone over to their Lake Washington house to visit my 5-year-old grandson. It was a Thursday afternoon. I walked into the living room eager to spend some time with the little boy. I had brought him a wooden toy train I carved myself. But the moment I stepped onto the pristine hardwood floors, the atmosphere turned to ice. Monica, my daughter-in-law, walked in from the kitchen. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She looked down at my shoes and let out an exaggerated sigh. "Richard," she said, her voice dripping with pure annoyance, "could you please take your shoes off at the door next time? You are scaring the European oak. We just had these polished." I looked down. My shoes were perfectly clean. I smiled politely and apologized, taking them off. But Monica was not finished. She crossed her arms and wrinkled her nose. She looked at me as if I were a piece of garbage that had blown into her perfect living room. "And honestly, Richard," she muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "you bring this smell with you. It is like old mothballs and stale coffee. It lingers in the house for days. I just want my home to smell fresh. Is that too much to ask?" I stood there in my socks, holding a wooden toy train, feeling a humiliation so deep it burned. I looked over at Derek. My son was standing by the kitchen island, holding a glass of sparkling water. He did not defend me. He did not tell his wife to show some respect. Instead, he just looked at me and smirked. He actually smirked. Then he took a sip of his water and said, "Dad, you know how sensitive Monica is about her house. Just try to be more mindful. Her house." He called it her house. He stood there in a multi-million-dollar mansion and allowed his wife to humiliate his 70-year-old father over a phantom smell and imaginary scratches. I did not cause a scene. I handed the wooden train to my grandson, patted his head, and told him Grandpa loved him. Then I walked out the front door. I drove home in absolute silence. I replayed that moment in my head 100 times. Her house. That was the phrase that echoed in my mind. You see, I never bothered to correct them or remind them of reality. I let them live in their fantasy world. But the reality was that the Lake Washington mansion did not belong to Monica. It did not belong to Derek. I bought that house for $2.5 million in cash using my retirement funds. I let them live there so my grandson would have a beautiful place to grow up. But I was the one who funded it. I was the silent foundation holding up their entire luxurious life, and they had the audacity to treat me like a nuisance. I spent my career dealing with ruthless corporate sharks in the commercial real estate market. I negotiated zoning laws with hostile city councils. I stared down predatory investors who tried to bleed my projects dry. I survived all of that because I never let emotion cloud my judgment. But family is different. You let your guard down. You ignore the warning signs because you want to believe the best about your own flesh and blood. I ignored the fact that Derek had never once thanked me for the home. I ignored the fact that Monica treated my visits like an obligatory chore. I let them treat me like a senile old fool because I wanted to keep the peace. But reading that text message flipped a switch inside me. The loving father stepped aside, and the retired real estate developer stepped back into the light. I evaluated my son and daughter-in-law not as family, but as an investment. And I realized they were the worst investment I had ever made. They were a liability draining my resources and returning nothing but disrespect. So when my phone buzzed that night at 9 o'clock, I was not entirely surprised. "Don't come to our house this weekend. Monica is stressed. We want peace." He was doubling down. He was choosing her disrespect over my dignity. I stood in my study, holding the glass of bourbon. I looked at the photograph of Derek when he was a little boy. I had spent my entire life trying to be the safety net for my son. I thought that by giving him everything he would learn to be generous and kind. Instead, I had created a monster of entitlement. I had created a son who thought his father was nothing more than a disposable walking bank account. I set the silver frame face down on the desk. I was done being the safety net. I was done making excuses for a grown man who lacked the spine to defend his own father. I picked up my phone. I did not write a long emotional paragraph explaining my feelings. I did not demand an apology. I simply typed 4 letters. "Okay." I hit send. I put the phone on silent and took another sip of my bourbon. The warmth of the drink settled in my chest, along with a new profound sense of clarity. They wanted peace. They wanted me out of their hair. They wanted to enjoy their perfect European oak floors without the inconvenience of the old man who paid for them. I decided I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to disappear from their daily lives, but my disappearance was going to come with a very steep price. Tomorrow morning, I was going to make a few phone calls. I was going to log into my banking portal, and I was going to sever every single financial lifeline I had quietly maintained for them over the years. They wanted the old man out of their house. Fine. Let us see how long they could keep that house without the old man paying the property taxes, the insurance, and the utility bills. The peace they requested was about to become the loudest silence of their entire lives. The morning sun cast long shadows across my hardwood floor. I woke up at exactly 6 o'clock, just as I had every day for the past 40 years of my life. The sleep had washed away any lingering paternal guilt, leaving a sharp clinical clarity. I brewed a pot of the strong dark coffee Monica always complained about. I carried my mug into the study and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop and listened to the quiet hum of the processor. Today was the exact day I stopped being a father and went back to being a businessman managing a poorly performing asset, logging into my primary banking portal. The screen displayed the aggregated wealth of a lifetime spent negotiating commercial real estate deals. I clicked on the specific family trust account I had set up 5 years ago. This was the invisible artery feeding Derek and Monica their perfect lifestyle. They liked to host cocktail parties and brag about their success to their friends in the tech industry. They conveniently forgot to mention that the $2.5 million Lake Washington property they lived in was purchased entirely in cash. My cash. I had liquidated 2 strip malls in Bellevue to make that purchase happen. I bought the waterfront mansion outright to ensure my grandson would never have to worry about a roof over his head. I allowed them on the deed to build equity, but retained primary ownership through a specific legal structure. They saw a free house. I saw an investment that I was solely responsible for maintaining. Derek makes a decent salary as a regional sales director, but decent does not cover the carrying costs of a luxury waterfront estate in one of the most expensive zip codes in the country. I was the one keeping the lights on. I opened the Scheduled Transfers tab. A long list of automated payments populated the screen. Every month, my accounts drained silently to fund their illusion of independence. I found the first target: King County property taxes. The government demands their pound of flesh twice a year for a luxury home. The upcoming tax installment was nearly $18,000. Derek lacked that kind of liquid cash. A prompt appeared asking if I wanted to terminate this scheduled transfer. I clicked yes without hesitation. I scrolled down to the utilities. Seattle Public Utilities for their water and trash collection, Puget Sound. Energy for the gas heating that kept their European oak floors warm during the winter. The premium fiber optic internet package Monica absolutely needed for her daily video calls. The luxury landscaping service that came twice a week to prune the hedges and mow the lawn so Derek would not have to break a sweat on his weekends. I clicked cancel on every single one of them. Stop payment, stop payment, stop payment. With each click, I felt a heavy invisible burden lifting from my shoulders. Then I found the largest recurring monthly expense: the comprehensive home and flood insurance policy. Waterfront properties carry massive liability risks, and the premium was astronomical. I opened the policy portal and revoked my credit card authorization. I did not cancel the policy entirely because I still needed to protect my own asset, but I removed the automated funding. The insurance company would send a notice of non-payment to the residents within 3 business days. If the premium was not met by the end of the week, the policy would lapse. Derek would open the mail and suddenly realize the safety net had evaporated. It took exactly 12 minutes to completely dismantle the financial infrastructure of their lives. 12 minutes to wipe away years of quiet, unconditional support. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my leather chair. My coffee was still hot. I took a sip and let the silence of my own house wash over me. It was profoundly quiet. It was the exact type of peace my son had so arrogantly demanded. I was simply honoring those arrogant wishes. I wanted me completely out of his daily existence, so I removed my presence. All of it. The physical and the financial. I walked over to the hallway console and picked up my cell phone. I opened the settings menu and activated the Do Not Disturb feature, allowing only emergency calls from my attorney to ring through. I specifically blocked notifications from Derek and Monica. I refused to see their names flash across my screen. I had no desire to read their casual weekend updates or their eventual panicked questions when the utility shut-off notices arrived. Absolute radio silence was the only appropriate response. I changed into my golf attire for a 9 o'clock tea time at the country club. I planned to spend my Saturday walking the manicured greens, enjoying the fresh air, and discussing municipal bonds with former business partners. I was choosing to enjoy my wealth and my newly reclaimed freedom. Instead of waiting by the phone for scraps of affection from ungrateful children, I was prioritizing my own peace of mind. The crisp morning breeze off the Puget Sound felt refreshing against my face. I loaded my clubs into the trunk of my car, feeling lighter than I had in years. As I drove my car toward the golf course, I thought about what Monday morning would look like at the Lake Washington house. The emails would start bouncing back. The billing portals would quickly flag their accounts for insufficient funds. The automated grace periods would end. When the bank ultimately demanded their massive overdue property tax check, the harsh reality of adulthood would finally crash down upon their fragile, sheltered existence. They demanded absolute isolation because they thought my presence was a burden. They were about to learn that true burdens come in the form of overdue invoices and tax liens. Let them fund their own isolation. I had already paid my dues in full. 72 hours passed in absolute tranquility before the digital storm began. I stood on the 12th hole of the Broadmoor Golf Club, lining up a difficult putt. My phone vibrated in the pocket of my slacks, with a series of rapid notifications. I sank the putt with a smooth, measured stroke before pulling the device out to inspect the screen. 3 messages from Derek sat waiting. The tone of his texts had already shifted from arrogant dismissal to a creeping sense of administrative confusion. He asked why the automated system for the property tax portal rejected his login credentials. I locked the screen without typing a reply and moved toward the golf cart. By the time I reached the 14th fairway, the digital notifications escalated into direct phone calls. The screen flashed my son's name repeatedly. I silenced the ringer and focused on my drive. Derek sent another text stating that the water company had just emailed a shut-off warning due to a revoked payment method. He demanded that I call the bank immediately to correct the glitch because Monica was planning to host a luncheon tomorrow. He still believed I was a compliant servant who had simply made a technological mistake. He had no idea he was stepping directly into a carefully laid trap. I selected a 9-iron and evaluated the wind direction, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I swung the club and watched the ball sail onto the green. I felt physically strong and mentally sharper than I had in decades. The men I played with complained about their aching joints and demanding families. I smiled and enjoyed the sunshine. I was no longer a tired old man carrying the weight of ungrateful dependence. I was a predator sitting patiently in the tall grass, watching my prey wander aimlessly into an enclosure with no exits. Panic is a poison. It starts with minor inconveniences and builds into consuming terror. I was deliberately letting that terror marinate inside the Lake Washington house. At noon, I retired to the clubhouse dining room and ordered a bone and ribeye with sparkling water. My phone buzzed again with a much longer text message. Derek had finally opened the morning mail. A certified letter from the insurance agency had been delivered to their doorstep. The text was no longer demanding a quick fix for a banking glitch. He was frantic. He asked why the homeowner insurance policy lacked a funding source and why the agency threatened immediate cancellation. He typed out a warning that the bank holding their secondary credit lines required active property insurance. I chewed my steak, slowly savoring the rich flavor. The dominoes were falling exactly according to the laws of financial physics. I left the golf course and drove toward downtown Seattle to visit my tailor. I decided it was the perfect afternoon to commission 3 new bespoke suits. While standing on the pedestal, having my measurements taken, the phone vibrated incessantly against the wooden table nearby. Derek had clearly spent his lunch break calling the various utility providers. A new text arrived stating that Puget Sound Energy informed him the primary account holder had deliberately severed all financial ties. The confusion in his messages mutated into outright panic. He asked if I had been hacked or if someone had stolen my identity. The concept that I intentionally cut him off remained completely unimaginable to his arrogant mind. I finalized my fabric selections and paid the tailor in full. Stepping out onto the busy city side, I relished the chaotic energy of the urban center. I walked past high-end storefronts and busy cafes, feeling completely detached from the manufactured crisis unfolding across town. Derek tried calling 4 more times in rapid succession. I watched the screen light up and go dark over and over. I was teaching him the true cost of the peace he had demanded. Peace is not free. It is a premium commodity purchased with hard-earned capital and mutual respect. Since he provided no respect, I revoked the capital. Returning to my quiet house, I spent the late afternoon in my personal library. I opened my primary investment portfolios and began reallocating the funds that previously drained into his lifestyle. I shifted massive amounts of liquid cash into aggressive growth stocks and high-yield municipal bonds. I felt a thrilling surge of productivity. The resources I had wasted on their superficial existence were now working solely for my benefit. I began drafting notes for a new philanthropic trust. I decided my wealth would eventually serve people who actually needed and appreciated support rather than subsidizing a spoiled heir. As dusk settled over the city, the nature of the text messages changed one final time. Monica took control of his phone. She sent a furious paragraph accusing me of throwing a pathetic tantrum. She demanded I restore the funding immediately because the landscaping company had just driven away after realizing their retainer was canceled. She threatened to deny me access to my grandson if I did not fix the situation by nightfall. I smiled at the screen. She was using the only weapon she had left, but she failed to realize I had already disarmed her. I deleted the message without reading it twice. The evening stretched out before me in glorious, uninterrupted silence. I prepared a simple dinner and sat by the large bay window, watching the ferry boats glide across the dark water. The absolute lack of responsibility for their manufactured chaos felt like a heavy chain removed from my neck. I knew they were currently sitting in their dark living room arguing about how to cover the massive shortfall staring them in the face. Their pristine hardwood floors could not save them from insolvency. I turned away from the window and walked toward my desk to organize my schedule for tomorrow. The heavy antique mahogany clock in the dark hallway chimed 8 times. I reached for my favorite book and settled into the leather reading chair. Suddenly, the loud, shrill ringtone of my phone shattered the quiet atmosphere. I did not look at the screen immediately, assuming it was another desperate attempt from my son. But the ringtone was a specific classical melody I had assigned to only one person. It was absolutely not Derek calling me tonight. I picked up the device and saw the name of my longtime attorney and trusted friend, Thomas Wright. I answered the phone call expecting a routine update, but his voice carried a sharp, breathless urgency that instantly chilled the entire room. I pressed the cold glass of the phone against my ear. Thomas Wright was not a man prone to dramatics. In the 30 years he had served as my primary legal counsel, I had only heard him sound this unsettled twice. Both times involved hostile corporate takeovers. Tonight his breathing was shallow and uneven. He skipped our usual pleasantries and asked if I was alone in the house. I confirmed my isolation. He then asked if I had recently authorized any major structural changes to the family trust. I told him I had not touched the trust documents since the initial purchase of the Lake Washington property. A heavy sigh echoed through the speaker. He informed me that the commercial underwriting division of Sterling Private Wealth had just flagged a highly irregular transaction. I walked slowly toward the bay window. I asked Thomas to give me the exact numbers without sugarcoating the situation. He stated that a loan file had crossed the desk of a senior underwriter less than 20 minutes ago. It was an application for a $1.5 million cash-out refinance against the waterfront estate. The terms of the requested loan were incredibly aggressive. They indicated a borrower willing to accept predatory interest rates in exchange for expedited funding. The closing date was scheduled for Tuesday morning. The sheer speed of the request had triggered an automated internal review at the bank. I asked Thomas why the bank called him instead of calling my primary cellular number. Thomas explained the precise mechanical failure in my son's plan. Derek had successfully altered the primary contact phone number on the digital application, routing it to a burner phone. However, he failed to realize that Sterling Private Wealth maintains a secondary legacy protocol for any property held in a trust exceeding $2 million. The loan officer noticed a glaring discrepancy. The designated payout account was not routed to my established portfolio. It was directed to a newly formed limited liability company registered in Delaware under a completely unfamiliar name. Following protocol, the bank contacted Thomas as the secondary legal custodian to verify this highly unusual destination for the funds. I instructed Thomas to bypass the bank's secure portal and forward the digital file directly to my encrypted email address. I needed to see the paperwork with my own eyes. My laptop chimed loudly in the quiet study. I opened the attachment and began scrolling past the standard preliminary disclosures and federal warning labels. I navigated straight to the final authorization page. The bright white screen illuminated the dark room. There in the center of the signature block was my name. I leaned closer to the monitor, analyzing the ink strokes. It was absolutely perfect. It was a flawless replication of my distinct, heavy-handed cursive. It captured the exact sharp, aggressive angle on the capital letter R and the familiar fading tail on the final letter N. Derek had not simply attempted to forge my handwriting with a pen. He was far too lazy for manual forgery. He had accessed my secure corporate digital archives. He had extracted a high-resolution vector graphic of my signature from an old joint venture contract we finalized 3 years ago. He pasted my identity onto a document designed to strip me of my wealth. A profound, icy realization washed over me. My son had not merely disrespected me in front of his wife. He had been quietly preparing to rob me blind for weeks. Compiling the necessary tax documents, accessing the corporate servers, and setting up a Delaware holding company required meticulous premeditation. The command to stay away from the house was not about Monica needing peace. It was a tactical maneuver. They needed me banned from the property so they could bring in independent bank appraisers and notary publics without the clueless old man wandering into the living room and asking questions. Thomas spoke rapidly through the speakerphone while I stared at the stolen signature. He began outlining the severe legal reality of the document on my screen. By transmitting fraudulent financial requests to a federally insured institution across state lines, Derek had triggered multiple federal statutes. Thomas listed the crimes with cold precision: aggravated identity theft, first-degree wire fraud, bank fraud. These were not minor civil infractions. These offenses carried mandatory minimum sentences in federal penitentiaries. Thomas stated that my son had crossed a boundary that erased all familial protections. The line crackled with static as my attorney waited for my inevitable explosion. When I offered only a measured, heavy silence, his professional composure finally fractured. Thomas raised his voice, demanding that we initiate a defensive protocol instantly. He declared that he was opening a secondary secure line to contact a special agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office downtown. He insisted we needed to freeze the underwriting process, lock down the property title, and have Derek arrested before the bank transferred a single dollar into that untraceable holding company. I listened to his frantic legal advice while calculating my own angles. If we blocked the application tonight, Derek would hire a team of aggressive defense attorneys. He would claim the submission was a simple clerical error. He might argue it was an accidental draft uploaded by an incompetent assistant. He could weave a narrative of a misunderstanding and slither away with a slap on the wrist. A failed application was just a mistake. A funded application was a concrete, undeniable felony. I needed him completely and inextricably entangled in his own web. I needed Derek to sign the final closing disclosures next week. I needed him to receive the stolen funds and commit himself so deeply to the fraud that no high-priced lawyer could ever untangle him from the federal charges. I needed the snare to tighten around his neck until escape was a physical impossibility. I interrupted Thomas just as I heard him begin dialing the federal agent on his secondary phone. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing off the mahogany bookshelves of my study. I told my lawyer to hang up the other phone immediately. No. Let the application proceed. I ended the call with Thomas and immediately dialed a number I had not used in nearly a decade. Marcus Vance was a former intelligence officer who transitioned into the lucrative world of corporate espionage and private investigation. His firm specialized in tracking hidden assets and uncovering the digital footprints of desperate people. He answered on the second ring. I bypassed all pleasantries and informed him I required a comprehensive financial and digital audit of my son and daughter-in-law. I needed to know every incoming and outgoing transaction, their current credit utilization, and the exact nature of the holding company they had registered in Delaware. I authorized a platinum retainer fee for expedited results. Less than 24 hours later, Marcus arrived at my house. He did not carry a briefcase. He simply placed a heavily encrypted tablet on my mahogany desk and typed in a complex passcode. The screen illuminated with a dizzying array of flowcharts, bank statements, and wire transfer logs. Marcus did not sit down. He stood with his arms crossed and began narrating the financial collapse of my son's life. The data painted a picture of absolute unmitigated greed, accelerating into sheer panic. Derek and Monica had not merely been living beyond their means. They had been actively gambling their entire existence on a phantom promise. Marcus tapped the screen, magnifying a series of transactions dating back 8 months. It started with minor withdrawals from their joint savings account. $5,000 here, $10,000 there. The money was being funneled into an offshore cryptocurrency exchange platform registered in the Bahamas under the name Apex Yield Dynamics. I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the sheer stupidity of the investment. Apex Yield Dynamics was not a legitimate financial institution. It was a classic high-yield investment program, a Ponzi scheme dressed up in modern blockchain terminology. They promised guaranteed returns of 15% per month. I had seen these scams decimate gullible investors for decades, but I never imagined my own son would fall for such an obvious trap. Marcus swiped the screen again, revealing a new layer of the investigation. He had dug into the executive structure of Apex Yield Dynamics. The platform was operated by a man named Julian Sterling. The name meant nothing to me, but Marcus quickly established the connection. He pulled up a series of archived social media posts and digital communications. Julian Sterling was Monica's ex-boyfriend from her university days. They had reconnected at a social gala nearly a year ago. Julian had sold her a narrative of exclusive insider access to an algorithm that guaranteed wealth. Monica, driven by an insatiable desire for status and luxury, had swallowed the lie completely. She had convinced Derek that this was their ticket to true financial independence, a way to build a fortune that did not rely on my generosity or my shadow. Derek, blinded by his wife's ambition and his own greed, had agreed to the plan. They started small, but the phantom returns. Julian showed them on a fabricated dashboard fueled their desperation. They wanted to escalate their investments, to become primary stakeholders in this non-existent algorithm. The flowcharts on the tablet shifted from their savings accounts to their credit lines. When their liquid cash ran out, they began leveraging debt. Marcus pointed out a series of massive cash advances drawn from high-interest credit cards. They had maxed out every available line of credit they possessed. They had even liquidated my grandson's college savings fund, a 529 plan I had established when he was born. They had sacrificed their child's future on the altar of a scam artist's promise. The Delaware Holding Company was the final desperate maneuver. Julian had informed them of a closed-door elite investment tier within Apex Yield Dynamics. The buy-in was exactly $1.5 million. In exchange, they were promised a guaranteed payout of $5 million within 6 months. It was the bait that finally forced Derek to cross the line from reckless investing into federal felony. They needed the cash, and the only asset they had access to was the Lake Washington property. I looked at the timeline of events mapped out on the tablet. The demand for peace, the text message banning me from the house, the sudden and intense desire for isolation. It all snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. It was not about Monica's stress or my shoes scratching the floor. It was a calculated logistical necessity. They needed the house completely empty. To secure a $1.5 million cash-out refinance, the bank required an independent on-site appraisal. They needed inspectors to walk through the property, evaluate the structural integrity, and assess the market value. They needed a mobile notary to witness the forged signatures on the preliminary disclosures. They could not risk me being present. A simple question from the actual homeowner to an appraiser would have shattered the entire illusion instantly. They needed the clueless old man out of the way so they could finalize the theft of his property in broad daylight. I stared at the blinking cursor on Marcus's tablet, the weight of his revelations pressing down on me. I needed a strategy, a way to dismantle this operation without prematurely alerting my son. The next morning, I drove to Thomas Wright's office in downtown Seattle. Thomas was waiting for me, his expression grave. I placed my laptop on his desk, bringing up the forged mortgage application and the digital trail Marcus had uncovered. Thomas adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the documents. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head slowly. "Richard, it's a masterpiece of fraud." The audacity is staggering. I leaned forward, my voice cold and steady. I don't want a lecture on the audacity, Thomas. I want a plan. A plan that ensures the bank processes this application exactly as Derek intended. Thomas looked at me bewildered. You want them to approve it, Richard? That's madness. If the funds are transferred, you're liable for the entire amount. I won't be liable if the funds never reach their intended destination, I replied, a chilling smile forming on my lips. I want the bank to approve it, Thomas. I want them to generate the closing documents. I want Derek's signature on every single page, solidifying his federal crimes. Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. You're playing a dangerous game, Richard. You're exposing yourself to incredible risk. I've mitigated the risk, I assured him. I need you to contact your counterpart at Sterling Private Wealth, the senior underwriter. You know him, don't you? Thomas nodded slowly. Arthur Pendleton. We've worked together on several commercial deals. Good, I said. Call Arthur. Tell him the application is legitimate. Tell him you've personally verified my intent to proceed with the cash-out refinance. I need him to push this file to the top of the pile, ensuring it receives immediate approval. Thomas hesitated, clearly torn between his legal obligations and his loyalty to me. Richard, if I do this, I'm essentially participating in the fraud. You're not participating in fraud, Thomas. You're participating in a sting operation. You're ensuring the bank has undeniable proof of Derek's intentions. When the time comes, I will provide the bank with the evidence of the forgery. But for now, they need to believe it's real. Thomas stared at me for a long time, the silence stretching between us. Finally, he nodded, a tight, grim expression on his face. All right, Richard, I'll make the call. As Thomas picked up the phone, I began outlining the next phase of the plan. I needed to ensure Derek and Monica remained completely oblivious to my knowledge. I needed them to believe their plan was proceeding flawlessly, fueling their desperation and their greed. I instructed Thomas to draft a series of emails, seemingly routine communications, regarding minor discrepancies in the application, requesting additional signatures or clarifications. These emails would be sent directly to the burner phone number Derek had provided, creating a false sense of security, a trail of breadcrumbs leading them deeper into the labyrinth. Thomas finished his call with Arthur Pendleton, his face pale. It's done, Richard. Arthur is pushing the file through. He expects to have the closing documents ready by Friday. Excellent, I murmured. Now we wait. We let them dig their own graves. The tension in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket of anticipation. We were orchestrating a high-stakes gamble, balancing precariously on the edge of legality, all to ensnare a son who had betrayed his father. My phone vibrated, shattering the silence. It was Marcus, the private investigator. I answered immediately, anticipating an update on the tracking of the offshore accounts. Richard, Marcus said, his voice unusually tense. I have new information. The offshore accounts are a diversion, a smokescreen. The real threat is much closer to home. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? I've intercepted a series of communications between Derek and a legal firm specializing in elder law. They're preparing to file a petition. My heart pounded. A petition for what? Marcus paused, at the silence stretching ominously. A petition for conservatorship, Richard. They're planning to declare you mentally incompetent and seize control of your entire estate. Marcus ended the call abruptly, stating he was 5 minutes away and needed to deliver the physical documentation. When he knocked on my door, rain was beginning to lash against the glass panes of my entryway. He stepped inside, shaking water from his dark trench coat, and handed me a heavy leather-bound portfolio. This wasn't just a summary. It was a granular forensic reconstruction of my son's total economic collapse. Marcus had bypassed standard encryption to pull the raw unfiltered data directly from the credit bureaus and banking mainframes, We moved into the dining room, spreading the spreadsheets across the polished oak table. The first page detailed Derek's revolving debt. He had opened 11 new credit lines in the past 45 days, using a fabricated income statement to secure approvals. The cumulative balance sat at $214,000. The interest rates attached to these unsecured loans bordered on usury, compounding daily and accelerating their ruin at a terrifying pace. Derek was attempting to outrun a financial avalanche by throwing gasoline on the snow. A separate tab highlighted Monica's individual expenditures. Despite their impending insolvency, her purchasing patterns had actually intensified. Yesterday afternoon, she had wired $7,000 to an exclusive interior designer for custom window treatments. She was completely dissociated from reality, spending phantom money while the ground crumbled beneath her feet. Marcus pointed to a specific recurring charge, $3,000 a week, flowing to a boutique crisis PR firm. They were already paying retainers to manage the potential social fallout of their impending bankruptcy. The most sickening revelation lay on page 4 of the thick financial packet. Marcus highlighted a closed account bearing my grandson's name. The college savings plan I had aggressively funded since his birth was completely empty. Derek had forged the withdrawal authorization, accepting a brutal 40% tax penalty just to liquidate the asset immediately. He stole his own son's future education to feed Julian's greedy Ponzi scheme. The transaction log showed the remaining funds were routed directly to the Bahamian crypto exchange at 3 in the morning. "I is stealing from his employer too," Marcus stated, sliding a thin blue folder toward me. Derek had submitted fraudulent expense reports to his regional sales firm. The amounts were relatively small, $5,000 here, $8,000 there, disguised as client entertainment and corporate retreats. He was using his company credit card to cover their grocery bills and luxury car leases. If his employer audited his division, he would face immediate termination and secondary embezzlement charges before the mortgage fraud ever came to light. My son was no longer just an ungrateful heir. He was a frantic, cornered animal, thrashing wildly in every direction. The arrogance he displayed during my visits was nothing but a fragile mask, hiding a man suffocating under the weight of his own criminal incompetence. He was leveraging every relationship, every asset, and every ounce of trust he possessed to delay the inevitable. The sheer velocity of his downward spiral indicated that Julian was demanding more capital to keep their elite investment tier active. Marcus walked over to my liquor cabinet, pouring himself a stiff measure of scotch without asking. "There is a secondary holding company," he said, turning back to face me. "Registered in Nevada just 2 days ago. They plan to use it to hide the remaining assets once the bank approves the refinance. The Nevada registry was structured to shield directors from civil litigation, a desperate attempt to build a firewall against the incoming federal investigations. Derek was taking legal advice from known criminals. I scrutinized the corporate officers listed on the documents. Monica's brother, a struggling real estate agent in Portland, was designated as the primary registered agent. They were pulling peripheral family members into the blast radius. If the federal authorities launched an investigation, Monica's brother would be indicted as a co-conspirator. They were infecting everyone they touched, treating their extended family as disposable shields. The sociopathy required to orchestrate this level of collateral damage was deeply chilling. "Which brings us to the final piece," Marcus whispered, setting his glass down on the coaster. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a thick manila envelope sealed with red tamper-evident tape. The wax emblem of a prominent, aggressive downtown litigation firm was stamped across the flap. My source inside the firm managed to extract this draft right off the senior partner's printer. They are filing it with the county clerk on Monday morning. I broke the seal, sliding the thick stack of legal parchment onto the table. The heading was printed in bold, uncompromising, black ink: petition for emergency temporary conservatorship. I read the first paragraph, and the temperature in the room seemingly plummeted. Derek was not the petitioner. Monica was. She was applying to be named my sole legal guardian, asserting that my sudden, unexplained withdrawal from family life was a clear indicator of rapid onset dementia. They had weaponized my silence. The draft included a fabricated timeline of events, claiming I had been found wandering the neighborhood, disoriented and hostile. They attached a falsified affidavit from a private physician I had never met, swearing under penalty of perjury that I posed an immediate danger to myself. The petition explicitly requested emergency powers to seize all of my financial accounts, revoke my driving privileges, and forcibly relocate me to a locked memory care facility in a remote suburb. The final page demanded the immediate suspension of my rights to hire independent legal counsel for my own defense moving forward. They wanted to strip me of my voice, my personal freedom, and my entire identity before I could even step into a courtroom to defend myself. It was a flawless, predatory legal strike designed to erase me from society entirely. My hands tightened around the edges of the petition, crinkling the expensive, thick paper. The sheer, calculating malice radiating from the document made my blood run absolutely cold. I flipped to the third page of the petition, where a sworn medical affidavit was attached. The document bore the letterhead of a doctor named Gregory Sterling. The last name matched the mastermind behind the cryptocurrency scam, draining my son's accounts. Julian Sterling had apparently enlisted a family member to fabricate my clinical diagnosis. Dr. Sterling testified under oath that he had evaluated me virtually and concluded I suffered from Lewy body dementia. The brazen coordination of this criminal network extended far beyond simple financial fraud. They were building a complete alternative reality, utilizing corrupt professionals to legally erase my autonomy. The filing strategy relied on a specific judicial loophole designed for extreme emergencies. Monica's attorney had requested an ex parte hearing scheduled for Monday morning at 9. This obscure legal maneuver meant the judge would review the petition and potentially grant temporary guardianship without me ever receiving prior notification. They intended to walk into a courtroom, present their fabricated medical emergency, and walk out with total legal authority over my life before I even finished my morning coffee. They were weaponizing the judicial system to execute a silent administrative assassination, leaving me entirely defenseless against their incoming financial pillaging. Attached to the back of the petition was a comprehensive schedule of my personal assets slated for immediate liquidation. They had not merely targeted my liquid cash or my stock portfolios. The document explicitly listed my late wife's vintage jewelry collection, stating the pieces would be auctioned to cover my anticipated long-term care expenses. My chest tightened as I read the itemized descriptions of her diamond necklaces and heirloom pearls. Derek intended to pawn his own mother's cherished possessions to appease his creditors. He was stripping away the last physical remnants of the woman who had given him life. The proposed residential care plan detailed my impending physical confinement. Monica requested authorization to transfer me to the Whispering Pines Memory Care Facility, located 3 hours away in a desolate rural county. I recognized the name from a recent local news expose detailing severe staff shortages and horrific patient neglect. They were not merely seeking to control my finances. They intended to lock me away in a dilapidated institutional nightmare, ensuring I remained heavily medicated and completely isolated from anyone who might question my sudden mental decline. They were deliberately condemning me to a neglected end in solitary confinement. The sheer mechanical precision of their timeline suddenly snapped into perfect focus. The ex parte hearing on Monday morning was the essential precursor to the Tuesday mortgage closing. The bank would require a final verbal authorization before wiring $1.5 million to the Delaware holding company. Derek knew I would never approve that transfer. However, if Monica was granted temporary conservatorship on Monday, she would possess the legal authority to authorize the wire transfer on Tuesday morning, acting entirely on my behalf. The two disparate criminal schemes were actually a single, perfectly synchronized and devastating financial strike. I dialed Marcus the investigator, instructing him to shift his immediate focus to Dr. Gregory Sterling. I needed his medical license number, clinic addresses, and any history of malpractice lawsuits or disciplinary actions located within the hour. If Julian Sterling was utilizing his brother or cousin to issue fraudulent psychiatric evaluations for the cryptocurrency syndicate, They had exposed a massive vulnerability in their armor. Taking down the corrupt physician would not only destroy the conservatorship petition, but also provide the federal authorities with a cooperative witness, eager to trade secrets for a reduced sentence in a medical fraud prosecution. I initiated a secure conference call with Thomas Wright, demanding he cancel his weekend plans. I briefed him on the impending Monday morning ambush. Thomas immediately suggested filing an emergency injunction to block the hearing. I explicitly forbade him from intervening prematurely. We needed them to enter that courtroom and officially submit the fraudulent documents into the judicial record. The moment they presented the perjured medical affidavit to a sitting judge, their conspiracy escalated into severe felony perjury. I instructed Thomas to prepare his litigation team to silently observe the proceedings and strike only after the crime was formalized. I formulated a secondary defensive measure to guarantee their absolute humiliation. I commanded Thomas to draft a comprehensive, durable power of attorney, naming himself as my sole financial and medical proxy, backdated and notarized appropriately to precede their Monday filing. Furthermore, we prepared an irrevocable trust amendment explicitly disinheriting Derek and immediately transferring my entire estate into a charitable foundation the second any external party attempted to claim guardianship. Even if the corrupt judge blindly approved Monica's petition, the legal structure would instantly evaporate the assets she sought to control, leaving her clutching an empty and worthless administrative title. The rain battered against my dining room windows as I arranged the fraudulent documents into a neat stack. They had vastly underestimated the resources required to cage a man who had spent 40 years surviving corporate warfare. Derek believed my silence over the weekend was proof of my vulnerability, a sign that his isolation tactic had shattered my spirit. He assumed I was sitting alone in my house, confused and helpless, while his sophisticated trap tightened around me. He lacked the fundamental understanding that true power does not panic loudly, but instead prepares its counteroffensive in absolute undisturbed silence. I picked up my glass of bourbon and walked toward the dark window, staring at my faint reflection in the glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the burning liquid. The grief that had anchored me to the floor earlier had completely burned away, leaving nothing but cold, predatory anticipation. My son wanted to play a high-stakes game of deception, forgery, and absolute ruin. He wanted to violently strip away my physical freedom, my financial legacy, and my mind. A slow, involuntary smile stretched across my face, reflecting brightly in the dark glass. The gloves were finally completely off, and I was now ready. The Monday morning ex parte hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock. I had precisely 48 hours to dismantle their medical ambush. I did not possess the luxury of waiting for Monday to contest the fraudulent claims in court. The moment a judge reviewed Dr. Sterling's perjured affidavit, a temporary conservatorship order could be issued, freezing my assets and effectively rendering me a ward of the state. I needed overwhelming, preemptive medical evidence to neutralize their attack before the ink on their petition was dry. I picked up the phone and contacted 3 distinct, highly regarded medical professionals in the Seattle area, bypassing standard scheduling protocols through aggressive financial persuasion. My first appointment was at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning with Dr. Aris Thorne, a leading neurologist specializing in early-onset dementia and cognitive decline. The examination was not a simple consultation. It was a grueling 3-hour battery of neurological stress tests. Dr. Thorne subjected me to advanced spatial reasoning puzzles, complex memory recall exercises, and rapid-fire verbal fluency assessments. I calculated compound interest equations in my head while simultaneously memorizing sequences of unrelated objects. The sheer intensity of the exam was designed to expose even the most subtle cognitive deficits. Dr. Thorne concluded the assessment and printed out a comprehensive 12-page diagnostic report. The results were unequivocal. He detailed my cognitive function as ranking in the 99th percentile for my demographic cohort, explicitly noting my exceptional executive function and robust working memory. He signed the document with a heavy fountain pen, his signature resting above his extensive medical credentials. The first pillar of my defense was secure, a medically verified testament to my absolute sanity. At noon, I arrived at the office of Dr. Evelyn Carter, a forensic psychiatrist who frequently testified as an expert witness in complex competency disputes. I did not require a standard psychological evaluation. I needed an airtight forensic defense against allegations of mental instability. Dr. Carter's examination was intensely psychological, probing my emotional regulation, my capacity for rational decision-making, and my understanding of complex financial consequences. She challenged me with hypothetical scenarios involving severe stress and high-stakes negotiations, carefully evaluating my responses for any signs of erratic behavior or emotional volatility. Dr. Carter's final report was not merely a medical diagnosis. It was a legal shield. She explicitly concluded that I possessed full testamentary capacity, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of my assets, my familial relationships, and the legal implications of my actions. She specifically noted the absence of any symptoms consistent with Lewy body dementia, directly contradicting the fraudulent claims in Dr. Sterling's affidavit. Her signature added a layer of forensic credibility that would be incredibly difficult for Monica's attorney to challenge in a courtroom. My final appointment was scheduled for 4 o'clock with Dr. Julian Vance, an independent neuropsychologist, renowned for his rigorous objective assessments. I needed a third entirely separate evaluation to eliminate any possibility of Monica's attorney claiming investigator bias. Dr. Vance's exam utilized advanced computerized cognitive testing, measuring my reaction times, my sustained attention, and my ability to process complex visual information. The digital assessments provided empirical, quantifiable data regarding my neurological health, removing any subjective interpretation from the diagnostic process. The computerized results confirmed the findings of the previous 2 examinations. Dr. Vance generated a detailed statistical analysis of my cognitive performance, highlighting his report concluded that my mental acuity was comparable to that of a healthy individual decades younger. He attached a notarized certificate of competency to his findings, providing the final, incontrovertible piece of evidence required to destroy the conservatorship petition. I returned home late Saturday evening, exhausted but deeply satisfied. I laid the 3 thick medical dossiers across my dining room table. These documents were not just medical records. They were weapons forged to shatter Derek and Monica's criminal conspiracy. I had subjected myself to 9 hours of intense neurological and psychological scrutiny, enduring a physical and mental toll to secure my absolute freedom. The resulting evidence was irrefutable, a triad of expert opinions confirming my complete mental competency. I scanned the final pages of each report, tracing the signatures of the 3 prominent physicians. The sheer weight of their combined authority rendered Dr. Sterling's fabricated affidavit practically radioactive. If Monica's attorney dared to submit that perjured document to a judge, he would be walking directly into a malpractice and fraud investigation. The trap I had laid was not merely defensive. It was designed to sever the limbs of the criminal network attempting to consume me. I gathered the medical dossiers and placed them securely inside a fireproof briefcase. The conservatorship threat had been systematically dismantled, neutralized by overwhelming empirical evidence. I was no longer a vulnerable old man susceptible to legal manipulation. I was an armed adversary holding the very documents that would guarantee their absolute ruin. The ex parte hearing on Monday would not be my downfall. It would be the stage for their catastrophic public exposure. Thomas Wright sat rigid behind his mahogany desk, staring at the thick portfolio of documents I had just laid out. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of his office seemed amplified by the heavy silence between us. I had not slept since the meeting with the investigators, my mind racing with permutations and legal defenses. Now I was ready to execute the second phase of my counteroffensive. I unclasped the leather binding and extracted a yellowed, heavy-stock document. It was the original trust agreement for the Lake Washington property drafted meticulously 5 years ago. I slid it across the polished wood toward Thomas, tapping my index finger on a specific dense paragraph buried deep within the addendums. Read subsection 4B, Thomas. I instructed, my voice barely above a whisper. I believe you drafted this section yourself at my explicit request. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses, his brow furrowing, as he scanned the legal jargon. He read this paragraph twice, his lips moving slightly as he processed the implications. He looked up at me, astonishment replacing his usual professional stoicism. The sunset clause, he breathed. I remember drafting this, Richard, but I thought it was an overly cautious, almost paranoid measure at the time. I never imagined it would actually be triggered. I offered a grim, humorless smile. In commercial real estate, paranoia is often just advanced preparation, Thomas. I've spent 40 years building safety nets against hostile takeovers and bad faith partners. I simply applied those same principles to my own family. The sunset clause was unambiguous. It stipulated that if any cosigner on the deed initiated any fraudulent financial transaction, encumbrance, or unauthorized lien against the property, their ownership stake would immediately and irrevocably forfeit. The entire property would automatically revert to the primary trust holder, me. Thomas leaned back, running a hand over his face. This means... He started, pausing to gather his thoughts. This means the forged mortgage application Derek submitted to Sterling Private Wealth isn't just a federal crime. It's the exact trigger mechanism for this clause. He looked down at the document again, shaking his head. By attempting to steal the house, he has legally handed it entirely back to you. Precisely, I confirmed. The moment that application was uploaded to the bank's server with my forged signature, Derek and Monica's equity in the property vanished. They are currently occupying a $2.5 million estate in which they hold zero legal interest. The satisfaction of the maneuver was cold and absolute. They thought they were outsmarting a frail old man. Instead, they had blindly stumbled into a legal bear trap I had set half a decade ago. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk. I need you to execute this, Thomas. Quietly. I want the preliminary paperwork filed with the county recorder's office by close of business today. I handed him a signed affidavit detailing the fraudulent mortgage application and formally invoking the sunset clause. Ensure the updated deed reflects my sole ownership. I want this locked down before the ex parte hearing on Monday. Thomas took the affidavit, his expression hardening into a mask of grim determination. I'll personally walk this over to the county clerk, he assured me. We'll bypass the standard processing queue. I know the head registrar. He owes me a favor. He began organizing the documents, placing them into a secure folder. The beauty of this, Richard, is that Derek won't receive a notification. The title transfer happens administratively. He will remain completely unaware that he no longer owns his home. That is exactly the point, I stated. I want them to continue their desperate scramble, believing they hold a winning hand. I want them to walk into that courtroom on Monday morning, convinced they are about to seize my entire estate while I hold the deed to the very house they sleep in. The trap was now multi-layered, a labyrinth of legal and financial dead ends designed to crush their arrogance. Thomas paused, looking up from his briefcase. There's one potential complication. He noted, his lawyer's mind already anticipating counter-arguments. If Derek's attorneys discover the title transfer before the hearing, they might try to use it as evidence of your supposed erratic behavior. They could argue that quietly seizing the house is proof of your cognitive decline. He tapped a pen against his desk, considering the angle. Let them, I replied smoothly, a surge of adrenaline cutting through my exhaustion. If they bring it up, they have to explain why the clause was triggered. They will be forced to introduce the forged mortgage application into the judicial record themselves, essentially confessing to federal fraud in an attempt to prove my dementia. It was a perfect, inescapable paradox. Every defensive move they attempted would only tighten the noose further around their own necks. Thomas let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It's a beautiful trap, Richard. Truly elegant. He snapped his briefcase shut, the sound sharp and final. I'll have the confirmation of the title transfer sent to your secure email by 5 o'clock today. The second pillar of my defense was now in place. The medical evaluations protected my mind and my freedom. The sunset clause protected my primary asset and stripped them of theirs. I stood up, adjusting my jacket. The exhaustion was still there, but it was overshadowed by a cold, calculating focus. I had neutralized their offensive capabilities. Now I needed to orchestrate their downfall with theatrical precision. I needed to let them play their hand completely, allowing their hubris to dictate their final fatal moves. The weekend would be a masterclass in silent warfare, and I was holding all the cards. "One more thing, Thomas," I added before turning to leave. "I received a text from Derek this morning. He wants me to come over for a make-up dinner tomorrow night. He says Monica feels terrible about the misunderstanding and wants to apologize." I saw the apprehension flash across Thomas's face. He knew exactly what that invitation truly meant. It wasn't an apology. It was a reconnaissance mission. "You're not going, are you?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with concern. "They're clearly trying to assess your mental state before the hearing. They want to see if you suspect anything." He shook his head vehemently. "It's too risky, Richard. You shouldn't be anywhere near them right now." I offered him another chilling smile. "Oh, I'm absolutely going, Thomas," I replied softly. "I'm going to play the confused, forgiving old man perfectly. I want them to feel utterly confident when they walk into that courtroom on Monday." I turned the brass handle of the office door, feeling a dark, satisfying anticipation. The stage was set, and I was ready for my performance. My phone illuminated the dark study with a harsh, glaring light. The screen displayed a new text message from Derek, shattering the absolute silence I had imposed upon them. The message was a masterclass in manufactured sincerity. It wrote that they had overreacted, that family was more important than temporary disagreements, and that Monica had prepared a special Sunday roast to apologize for the misunderstanding. He requested my presence at 6 o'clock, emphasizing that my grandson had drawn a picture specifically for me. The timing of the invitation confirmed the strategic analysis I had discussed with Thomas. Derek did not want a reconciliation. He required a live reconnaissance mission. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. To successfully execute their ex parte ambush, they needed absolute certainty that I suspected nothing. They needed to observe my behavior, document any signs of confusion they could later present to the judge, and ensure I was completely docile. I tapped the screen and sent a brief, gracious acceptance, allowing them to believe their manipulation was successful. I arrived at the Lake Washington property precisely at 6. I did not park in the driveway. I parked on the street, ensuring my departure would not be hindered. I walked toward the front door, deliberately slowing my pace, adopting a slight, uncharacteristic shuffle. When Derek opened the door, his eyes immediately scanned my face, searching for any signs of suspicion or anger. I offered him a tired, warm smile, portraying the image of a lonely father desperate for connection. The interior of the house was aggressively pristine. Monica stood by the kitchen island wearing an apron over a designer dress, holding a silver platter of roasted vegetables. She greeted me with a forced, overly sweet tone, apologizing profusely for her previous outburst regarding the hardwood floors. She claimed she had been suffering from severe migraines, attributing her rudeness to stress rather than entitlement. I nodded sympathetically, assuring her that I understood the pressures of modern life. Derek poured me a glass of iced tea, guiding me toward the dining room table. He casually steered the conversation toward my daily routine, probing for vulnerabilities. He asked if I had been experiencing any memory lapses, mentioning an article he had read about cognitive decline in seniors. I played the role perfectly. I hesitated before answering, rubbed my temples, and confessed that I had occasionally forgotten where I placed my keys. I added a self-deprecating laugh, stating that old age was finally catching up with my sharp mind. Monica's eyes flicked toward Derek, a triumphant, almost predatory smirk flashing across her face before she quickly suppressed it. She believed my feigned vulnerability validated the fabricated medical affidavit they intended to submit to the judge. Derek exhaled a slow, quiet breath, clearly relieved that I was presenting the exact symptoms they required for their legal narrative. He patted my hand across the table, assuring me that they would always be there to take care of me, a promise that masked their true intention to institutionalize me. After dinner, my grandson ran into the room holding a crayon drawing of a blue house and 3 stick figures. I scooped him into my arms, feeling a genuine, sharp pang of sorrow. The child was completely innocent, unaware that his parents had liquidated his college fund to finance a criminal syndicate. I thanked him for the drawing, folding it carefully and placing it in my breast pocket. I knew this might be the last time I saw him before the inevitable collapse of his parents' fabricated reality. I excused myself shortly after dessert, claiming a sudden wave of exhaustion. Derek offered to drive me home, a final attempt to monitor my movements, but I declined, insisting I preferred the quiet drive. Monica hugged me at the door, her embrace rigid and devoid of any genuine affection. She whispered that they loved me, a lie so hollow it echoed against the impending legal warfare. I walked slowly down the driveway, maintaining the facade of a frail, declining elder until I was safely out of sight. The moment I closed my car door, the performance ended. I sat in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, the manufactured exhaustion instantly replaced by cold, ruthless energy. The dinner had been a sickening display of emotional manipulation, but it had provided the exact confirmation I needed. They were fully committed to their path. They felt completely secure in their deception, utterly blind to the legal guillotine positioned directly above their necks. I started the engine and drove exactly 3 blocks before pulling over to the side of the dark, quiet road. I retrieved a secondary encrypted mobile device from the glove compartment, a secure line I had procured specifically for this communication. I dialed Thomas Wright's personal cell number, bypassing the firm's standard switchboard. He answered immediately, his voice tense, anticipating my command. "The reconnaissance is complete," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the confined space of the vehicle. "They suspect absolutely nothing. They are proceeding with the conservatorship filing tomorrow morning, and they fully believe the bank is approving the refinance." I paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle between us. "Initiate the sequence, Thomas. Trigger the bank fraud alert." The moment my tires hit the interstate, I brought Thomas off hold. "Execute the kill switch," I ordered. "Contact the fraud division at Sterling Private Wealth immediately." Thomas confirmed he was patching Arthur Pendleton into a secure, recorded line. The objective was no longer to delay the mortgage application, but to weaponize it. By formally notifying the bank's security matrix of the forged signature, we initiated an irrevocable cascade of federal compliance protocols. Arthur was legally obligated to act instantly. Within seconds, the bank's automated risk management software took control of Derek and Monica's entire financial portfolio. The system algorithms designed to isolate wire fraud placed a hard lockdown on the pending $1.5 million refinance. This freeze was merely the epicenter. The containment protocols automatically sought out every account, sharing Derek's social security number and Monica's marital linkages. Their primary checking, their depleted savings, and their joint credit lines were instantly flagged, suspended, and removed from their direct control. The financial contagion spread rapidly through the banking network. The holding company registered in Delaware, which Derek had created to receive the stolen funds, was similarly blacklisted. International wire privileges were revoked, and all linked debit cards were electronically deactivated. The bank essentially erected an impenetrable digital wall around their identities. They were officially locked out of the modern economy, rendered financially paralyzed, without receiving a single warning notification or automated email alert. I parked my vehicle in my garage and booted up my dedicated surveillance laptop. Marcus, my private investigator, had established a real-time monitor on the metadata surrounding their digital footprint. A green light on my screen confirmed the total lockdown was complete. The trap had snapped shut with flawless precision. Derek and Monica were currently sleeping in their master bedroom, blissfully unaware that they had just been economically erased. They would wake up as financial ghosts, possessing zero purchasing power. Simultaneously, a new crisis ignited across the city. Julian Sterling, the architect of the cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme, was encountering severe liquidity shortages within his illicit operation. Marcus intercepted a series of frantic encrypted messages originating from the primary server. Julian was facing demands from higher-tier investors and desperately needed fresh capital to maintain his fake algorithm. He could no longer afford to wait for Derek and Monica's buy-in. He needed the $1.5 million injection by sunrise, or his entire house of cards would implode. At exactly 6:30 the next morning, Julian transmitted a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum directly to Monica's phone. The message abandoned the previous facade of exclusive investment opportunities and elite tiers. It was a raw, aggressive demand for immediate payment. Julian explicitly stated that if the wire transfer did not hit his offshore ledger by 9 o'clock, their position would be liquidated and a collection team would be dispatched to recover the promised capital. The grace period was officially over, replaced by the imminent threat of physical extortion. Monica read the message while standing in the kitchen of the Lake Washington house. The tracking software registered her immediate attempt to placate Julian. She replied with a confident, dismissive text, assuring him that the bank refinance was closing imminently and the funds would clear momentarily. She firmly believed the illusion of her impending wealth remained intact. To soothe her escalating anxiety, she decided to leave the house and purchase a ridiculously expensive artisanal coffee, a routine habit designed to validate her perceived upper-class status. She stood at the counter of the upscale cafe, handing the barista her premium rewards credit card. The card reader beeped an angry, sharp tone. The terminal displayed a stark, declined error. Monica scoffed, assuming it was a simple fraud alert triggered by an unusual purchase. She produced a secondary platinum debit card offering an arrogant apology to the growing line of customers behind her. The machine rejected the second card instantly. The barista looked at her with pity, politely requesting an alternative form of payment. Humiliated, Monica fled the cafe empty-handed and frantically dialed Derek. Back at the house, Derek was already sitting at his home office desk, attempting to log into their primary banking portal to investigate her declined transactions. Instead of his usual account dashboard, he was greeted by a blank white screen featuring a bold red banner. The text was unyielding: account suspended due to suspected fraudulent activity. Please contact the Federal Compliance Department immediately. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering against the polished desk. Derek raced to his briefcase, pulling out every piece of plastic he owned. He tried logging into different financial institutions, desperately searching for a functional account. Every single portal returned the exact same suspension message. The fraud alert had propagated through the ChexSystems network, prompting other banks to preemptively freeze their accounts to limit liability. The magnitude of the catastrophe crashed down upon him. He was completely locked out of his own life, lacking the funds to buy a gallon of gas, let alone $1 million investment. The silence in the house was abruptly shattered by the sound of Monica's cell phone ringing incessantly. It was Julian. The 9 o'clock deadline had arrived, and the offshore ledger remained empty. Derek snatched the phone from his trembling hands and answered the call. Stammering a chaotic string of excuses about banking glitches and delayed processing times, Julian cut him off with a chilling deadpan threat. Julian informed Derek that banking errors were not his concern, and patience was no longer an option. The Ponzi operator stated that since the cash was unavailable, he would send associates to the Lake Washington property to secure collateral. Julian specifically mentioned the vintage jewelry collection and luxury vehicles parked outside. The true terrifying reality of their situation paralyzed them both. They were entirely stripped of their stolen wealth, facing a ruthless criminal syndicate, and they possessed absolutely zero access to any funds to save themselves. The midnight hour arrived with a heavy downpour rattling the expansive windows of the Lake Washington estate. Derek sat, bathed in the harsh blue light of his laptop screen in the center of the dark living room. He desperately typed the routing digits of a hidden corporate expense account he had concealed from everyone. His fingers moved frantically across the keyboard, attempting to initiate a direct wire transfer to appease the mounting threat. He clicked the submit button and waited. A stark crimson error message instantly materialized on the monitor. The transaction was categorically blocked by a newly enacted compliance hold. Across the room, Monica emptied the contents of her designer handbag directly onto the marble kitchen island. She frantically sorted through discarded receipts and loose cosmetics until she located a dormant prepaid debit card. She picked up her mobile device and attempted to load a balance using a secondary routing number tied to a forgotten credit union. The automated voice on the customer service line informed her that the linked funding source was currently under federal investigation. She dropped the phone onto the counter, watching the screen fade to black. Inside my private study, the encrypted surveillance laptop glowed softly on the mahogany desk. I watched the live keystroke logs Marcus had successfully embedded within their personal devices. A fresh notification popped onto my dashboard, detailing the rejected wire transfer. The system flagged the attempt with a specific code indicating a hard security freeze. I leaned forward and observed the digital desperation unfolding in real time. They were blindly throwing digital punches against an impenetrable financial fortress. I poured a fresh measure of Kentucky bourbon into my crystal glass, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain outside. Another alert chimed on my monitor. Derek was now attempting to log into a digital payment application to liquidate microscopic fractions of cryptocurrency. It was a pathetic scramble for insignificant pennies when the syndicate demanded a massive capital injection. The application required two-factor authentication linked to an email address that the bank had already locked down. His access was denied instantly. Monica's mobile device vibrated with a new encrypted text message originating from an untraceable number. The notification explicitly stated that a dark utility vehicle was currently idling at the entrance of their gated community. She sprinted toward the front bay window and peeled back the edge of the heavy custom curtains. Through the driving rain, she spotted the bright headlights piercing the darkness. The syndicate associates had officially arrived to monitor their physical movements. The financial problem had mutated into an immediate physical threat. Derek suggested abandoning the property and securing a room at an anonymous downtown hotel to hide until morning. He quickly pulled up a booking application on his phone. He input the 16 digits of a corporate travel card, hoping the commercial network remained unaffected by the personal banking freeze. The reservation software processed the request for exactly 4 seconds before returning a payment failure notification. The automated system canceled the booking, confirming they were entirely stranded within the crosshairs of the waiting extortionists. My surveillance screen mirrored the hotel rejection in real time. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid, savoring the intense burn in the back of my throat. The digital perimeter I had established was functioning flawlessly. It acted as an invisible electric fence, keeping the panicked subjects trapped securely inside their designated enclosure. Every frantic attempt to breach the boundary only delivered another paralyzing shock to their system. They possessed absolutely no avenue for escape. Monica turned on Derek with a harsh, trembling whisper, demanding he contact his wealthy business associates for an emergency short-term loan. Derek dialed 3 different colleagues, attempting to project a tone of casual urgency. Every single call routed directly to an automated voicemail service. The sudden implementation of the banking contagion had likely triggered automated alerts to his employer's compliance department, advising his colleagues to sever all immediate contact. His professional network had evaporated simultaneously with his wealth. I watched the metadata of the failed outbound calls populate my screen. I logged out of the surveillance portal and closed the laptop lid with a soft, deliberate click. The sheer volume of their desperation had become entirely monotonous. It was a predictable loop of systemic rejection that no longer required my active supervision. The trap had sealed perfectly, and the prey had exhausted their final reserves of energy, fighting against the steel jaws. Derek threw his useless phone across the living room. The device shattered violently against the European oak floor, scattering glass shards across the polished surface. He stood in the center of the room, realizing there remained only one person in the entire city, possessing the liquid capital and the presumed ignorance to bail them out of this catastrophe. He looked toward Monica and whispered a new, desperate objective. They needed to visit my house and force a signature to release the funds. I washed my crystal glass in the small brass basin located in the corner of the study. I listened to the rhythmic ticking of the antique hallway clock, echoing through the silent corridors. My home was perfectly still, functioning as a fortress of engineered calm. I walked up the wooden staircase, feeling a deep, profound sense of physiological relief. The toxic burden of their existence was completely severed from my daily reality. I stepped into my bedroom and removed my tailored clothing. I turned off the bedside lamp and rested my head against the cool, firm pillow. I reached over to the digital clock on the nightstand and set the alarm for exactly 5:30. I closed my eyes and allowed the darkness to envelop me. I drifted into a deep, uninterrupted slumber, feeling absolutely no anxiety regarding the impending morning. I knew exactly which two desperate individuals would be pounding heavily on my front door at the very break of dawn, and I was perfectly prepared to greet them. My digital alarm clock chimed a soft melody at exactly 5:30 in the morning. I rose from the mattress, feeling rested, and moved into the master bathroom to begin my routine. I selected a crisp white shirt and a tailored cardigan, carefully combing my hair and securing my watch. The heavy oak front door immediately began to rattle under the force of violent pounding at precisely 6:02. The dull thuds echoed up the wooden staircase, matching the exact schedule of desperation I predicted. I descended the steps at a measured pace, letting the frantic knocking escalate. I unfastened this deadbolt and pulled the heavy door inward, letting the cold morning air sweep into the foyer. Derek and Monica stood on my front porch, looking absolutely feral. My son wore the same wrinkled clothes from the previous day, his hair plastered to his forehead with rain. Monica shivered uncontrollably, her expensive designer coat hastily buttoned over pajamas, and her face completely devoid of makeup. They did not wait for an invitation to enter my home. Derek shoved past my shoulder, pushing his wife into the warm hallway before slamming the heavy door shut. He locked the deadbolt behind him with trembling fingers, scanning the perimeter of my quiet living room, as if expecting armed men. Monica immediately began pacing across the woven rug, biting her cuticles down to the quick. She had abandoned her aristocratic posture, adopting the erratic movements of a cornered fugitive. My son turned to face me with wild, bloodshot eyes and launched into a chaotic, breathless monologue. He asked if I had checked my primary banking portals during the night. He stated he attempted to log into the family trust dashboard just after midnight and found a catastrophic system failure. He openly admitted trying to bypass my firewalls, claiming he was merely conducting a routine financial health check. He yelled that every single account bearing my name was frozen under a massive federal compliance hold. I maintained a completely blank expression, projecting the image of a bewildered senior citizen. I slowly turned my back on their manic energy and walked toward the kitchen to brew a fresh hot pot of coffee. My deliberate movements forced them to follow me, trailing behind my heels like desperate shadows. I filled the glass carafe with filtered water and poured ground beans into the machine, listening to their frantic breathing. I needed to let them exhaust their initial adrenaline rush. Monica slammed her hands flat against the granite countertop, startling me intentionally. She shrieked that making coffee was an absurd priority when our entire financial existence was under attack. She confessed trying to initiate a massive wire transfer from the Joint Emergency Fund at 2 in the morning to pay an overseas contractor. She claimed this imaginary contractor threatened to seize their property assets if a pending invoice was not settled immediately. Her voice cracked loudly, describing the utter humiliation of having her digital authorization rejected repeatedly. Derek stepped forward and placed a hand on his wife's trembling shoulder, attempting to take total control. He spun a sophisticated fabrication about a coordinated foreign cyber attack targeting affluent commercial real estate portfolios in the city. He lied effortlessly, stating he had spent the entire night on the phone with federal banking monitors trying to shield my wealth from international hackers. He presented himself as my vigilant protector, claiming the bank initiated a hard lockdown on my assets, specifically because the hackers triggered a systemic security breach across my investment accounts. He reached into his pocket and threw his luxury car keys onto the kitchen island, missing the bowl completely. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely keep his fingers straight. He admitted their vehicle had barely coasted into my driveway on empty fumes because the gas station pump declined every single piece of plastic in his wallet. He painted a picture of total economic collapse, insisting the hackers had somehow infected his personal credit lines through our shared marital and familial banking linkages. The false urgency in his tone escalated into outright hostility. He insisted the financial institution required physical personal authorization from me to reboot the banking matrix. He explained his supposed federal contacts established a highly secure secondary digital ledger to protect my liquid cash. He claimed the bank needed me to immediately release all frozen funds directly into this new secure routing number. It was the only possible method to bypass the compromised system and save our family from total imminent bankruptcy. Monica checked her mobile phone, her eyes darting nervously toward the front windows. She blurted out that we had a strict deadline of 9 o'clock to complete the security protocol. She warned if the funds were not safely routed to the new ledger by 9, the bank would permanently seize the entire investment portfolio, pending a 10-year federal investigation. She was taking the very real deadline issued by the cryptocurrency syndicate and superimposing it over their ridiculous cyber attack lie. Derek aggressively unzipped his soaked leather briefcase, dropping it onto my clean counter. He extracted a thick document bearing the official logo of my primary wealth management institution. Rainwater had smeared the ink along the bottom edges, but the bold black title remained perfectly legible. He smoothed the wrinkled pages out onto the marble surface, pinning the corners down with his palms so I could read the aggressive legal terminology printed across the first paragraph. It was a guarantor form drafted to grant him absolute and total unrestricted power of attorney over my entire estate. Derek pointed a shaking finger at the signature line, demanding I authorize the document immediately to fix the banking glitch he had just invented. He yelled that my stubborn silence was jeopardizing my grandson, and I needed to sign the paper right now to release the funds. He shoved a heavy silver pen into my hand, commanding me to surrender my entire life to him this exact second. I took the heavy silver pen Derek thrust toward me and placed it deliberately back onto the kitchen counter. I turned away from the frantic document and focused entirely on the coffee maker. The machine hissed and sputtered, a mechanical sound that amplified the suffocating tension in the room. The aroma of dark roast beans filled the air, contrasting sharply with the stale sweat and desperation radiating from my son. I poured the steaming liquid into a ceramic mug, adding exactly 2 teaspoons of sugar. I did not rush. I let the silence stretch until it became physically painful for them. Derek's face flushed a deep mottled red. The control he had attempted to project evaporated, replaced by genuine, unadulterated fury. He slammed his fist against the marble island, the sound echoing sharply. He yelled that my refusal to cooperate was the direct cause of this crisis. He claimed my deliberate isolation over the weekend was a selfish, malicious act that forced him to bypass standard protocols to protect my assets. He essentially blamed me for the existence of the forged guarantor form, arguing that his desperate actions were entirely necessitated by my negligence. Monica stepped forward, her body language abruptly shifting from aggressive pacing to performative vulnerability. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a series of ragged theatrical sobs. She collapsed against Derek's shoulder, a calculated display of spousal dependency. She whimpered that she was terrified that she had not slept in 2 days because of the overwhelming stress. She painted herself as the fragile victim of my stubbornness, completely ignoring her own role in orchestrating the cryptocurrency scam that had precipitated their ruin. I took a slow sip of my coffee, observing her performance with clinical detachment. Her tears were remarkably dry, her shoulders shaking in a rhythmic, practiced pattern. Derek wrapped his arm around her, glaring at me with self-righteous indignation. He declared that my rigid refusal to sign the document was actively traumatizing his wife. He spun a narrative where I was the hostile aggressor, and they were simply trying to salvage the family legacy from an unprecedented cyber attack. The audacity of his lies was almost impressive in its sheer volume. Monica raised her head, her eyes wide and pleading. She abandoned the cyber attack narrative, entirely pivoting to a much more potent emotional weapon. She screamed that the bank had threatened to immediately foreclose on the Lake Washington property if the security glitch was not resolved by 9 o'clock. She claimed the utility shutoffs were a precursor to imminent eviction. She spun a hysterical fabrication about bank representatives waiting at the gates of their community, ready to seize the house the moment the deadline passed. She took a step toward me, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, deploying the ultimate manipulative strike. "If you don't sign this, she screamed, "your grandson will be out on the street. Do you want him to be homeless?" She was explicitly threatening the child's well-being, attempting to leverage my paternal affection against my legal autonomy. The room fell dead silent, the echo of her threat hanging in the air. The final card had been played. I took one final deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, complex flavor profile. The warmth of the liquid contrasted sharply with the glacial stillness settling over my posture. Monica's hysterical scream echoed off the high ceilings, her threat regarding my grandson hanging suspended in the air like a poorly constructed theatrical prop. Derek leaned over the marble island, his knuckles white, expecting me to crumble under the emotional blackmail. I set the ceramic mug down on the granite countertop. The sharp clink of the porcelain cut through their manufactured panic with absolute finality. The performance, the fragile facade of the oblivious elder, was officially terminated. I bypassed the forged guarantor form entirely. Reaching beneath the counter, I retrieved a heavy black leather portfolio I had positioned there an hour before their arrival. I placed it squarely between Derek's trembling hands and Monica's tear-stained face. The portfolio was not merely a collection of documents. It was a physical manifestation of their impending ruin. I unclasped the brass buckle, the sharp snap, silencing Monica's manufactured sobs instantly. I extracted the first dossier, wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve, and slid it toward my son. The document bore the official seal of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, flanked by the logo of Sterling Private Wealth. It was not a glitch notification. It was a formal declaration of suspected wire fraud triggered by the upload of my forged signature. I pointed to the specific paragraph detailing the unauthorized attempt to encumber a trust asset. The text clearly outlined the automatic implementation of the systemic compliance freeze. Derek's eyes widened as he read the federal statute codes listed at the bottom of the page, recognizing the inescapable legal reality of his actions. I did not allow him time to process the banking catastrophe. I pulled the second file from the portfolio, a thick stack of medical reports bound by a heavy metal clip. I tossed it onto the marble island, the resounding thud making Monica flinch. These were not generic health summaries. They were the comprehensive, notarized evaluations from 3 of the top neurologists and forensic psychiatrists in Seattle. The top page featured a highlighted conclusion from Dr. Aris Thorne, explicitly confirming my cognitive function ranked in the 99th percentile, utterly obliterating the fabricated Lewy body dementia diagnosis they had procured from Dr. Gregory Sterling. Derek's gaze darted from the federal fraud alert to the psychiatric evaluations. The color began to rapidly drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He realized I possessed intimate knowledge of their secondary specialized attack vector. He knew that I knew about the ex parte conservatorship hearing scheduled for Monday morning. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. The arrogant certainty that he could easily manipulate my mental health status evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing dread. I extracted the final, most devastating document. It was Marcus's forensic financial audit summarizing the complete collapse of their personal wealth. I did not focus on the maxed-out credit lines or the liquidated college fund. I turned directly to the appendix detailing the Bahamian cryptocurrency exchange Apex Yield Dynamics. The page featured a high-resolution photograph of Julian Sterling, accompanied by a detailed flowchart mapping the transfer of their stolen funds into his offshore accounts. I slid the photograph directly in front of Monica, tapping Julian's face with my index finger. Monica gasped, stumbling backward until her spine hit the stainless steel refrigerator. The blood rushed from her cheeks, leaving her looking entirely translucent. She realized her secret illicit collaboration with her ex-boyfriend was not merely exposed. It was meticulously documented by a professional investigator. The illusion of her victimhood shattered completely. She understood that her attempt to paint me as the villain was entirely neutralized by empirical evidence proving she was an active, willing participant in a massive criminal conspiracy. I leaned forward, bracing my hands on the marble countertop, closing the physical distance between us. My voice dropped to a low, resonant register stripped of any paternal warmth. I systematically dismantled the cyber attack narrative Derek had constructed moments earlier. I detailed exactly how the bank had flagged the routing number of the Delaware holding company they had established. I explained how their attempt to expedite the $1.5 million refinance had triggered the very alarms that isolated them from the financial system. Derek stepped back from the island, his posture crumbling. The aggressive, domineering stance he had projected upon entering my home collapsed into defensive shrinking. He looked at the array of documents spread across the counter, the undeniable proof of his treason. He finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. He realized he had not been manipulating a confused, isolated senior citizen. He had been blindly navigating a sophisticated, legally bulletproof labyrinth engineered by a man who had spent 40 years destroying corporate predators. Monica slid down the face of the refrigerator, her knees giving way beneath her. She sat on the hardwood floor, staring blankly at the photograph of Julian Sterling. The reality of the syndicate's deadline crashed back into her consciousness, now entirely unmitigated by the hope of my financial intervention. They were trapped between a ruthless extortionist demanding payment and a federal fraud investigation they had inadvertently initiated against themselves. They possessed no leverage, no capital, and no escape routes. I picked up the forged guarantor form Derek had aggressively pushed toward me earlier. I held the document up by the corner, analyzing the desperate, chaotic scrawl of his handwriting in the margins. I did not tear it up or throw it away. I carefully folded the paper and placed it inside the black leather portfolio alongside the other evidence. It was the final tangible proof of his attempt to extort me a document that would prove invaluable during the impending legal proceedings. I looked at my son, observing the absolute terror currently paralyzing his cognitive functions. I was waiting for me to scream, to hurl insults, or to demand an explanation for his betrayal. He anticipated a massive emotional explosion that would allow him to respond defensively. I offered him nothing but clinical, terrifying silence. The realization slowly dawned on his face. I had not assembled this dossier to negotiate a settlement or to extract an apology. I had assembled it to execute a flawless, systemic eradication of their entire existence. Derek lunged across the marble island. His hand shot forward, aiming directly for the conservatorship draft, resting beside the psychiatric evaluations. He intended to destroy the physical evidence before I could use it against him. My reflexes, honed by decades of discipline, reacted faster than his desperate scramble. I brought my hand down with crushing force, pinning his wrist flat against the cold stone countertop. The sharp slap of a flesh-meeting granite echoed through the kitchen. He gasped, attempting to yank his arm back, but my grip remained absolute, holding him completely captive. I leaned my body weight into the hold, forcing him to bend awkwardly at the waist. His face was mere inches from the scattered documents detailing his imminent incarceration. He stared up at me, his eyes wide with physical agony and dawning terror. He expected a frail 70-year-old man, but he was wrestling with a predator who had shed every ounce of paternal softness. Monica shrieked and took a step forward, but I raised my free hand, leveling a single warning finger at her chest. She froze instantly, trapped by the sheer predatory authority radiating from my posture. "You wanted peace," I began, my voice dropping to a gravelly, resonant pitch that demanded absolute silence. "I gave you peace. I gave you the exact isolation you demanded so arrogantly through that text message. While you were busy plotting to declare me legally insane and lock me in a dilapidated facility, I was dismantling the very foundation of your existence." I applied additional pressure to his pinned wrist, watching the blood drain from his knuckles. "You thought your silence isolated me. In reality, it simply provided the undisturbed quiet I needed to execute your financial execution without any interruptions." Derek grimaced, trying to leverage his shoulder to break my hold. I stepped to the side, twisting his arm slightly to neutralize his leverage. I instructed my attorneys to activate the sunset clause embedded in the original property trust. I continued, my tone devoid of any empathy. "The moment your forged mortgage application hit the federal banking servers, your equity in the Lake Washington estate evaporated entirely." Thomas filed the reversion paperwork late Friday afternoon. The county recorder processed the title transfer, completely bypassing the standard queues. Monica gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth. The implications crashed into her frantic mind, stripping away her last remaining delusion of security. "I am no longer a co-owner of that property," I stated, emphasizing every syllable for maximum impact. "I am now the sole exclusive legal proprietor of the $2.5 million mansion you currently occupy. You do not own a single square inch of European oak or waterfront shoreline. You are currently trespassing on my private property, and you have absolutely nowhere to run." The fight completely left Derek's body. His muscles went slack beneath my grip, his knees buckling slightly as the structural reality of his life collapsed. I released his wrist, pushing his hand away with a gesture of profound disgust. He stumbled backward, rubbing his bruised skin, his breath coming in shallow, rapid pants. He looked at the forged guarantor form he had brought to my house, realizing it was a useless piece of paper. He had brought a water pistol to a nuclear strike. He was completely outmatched, outmaneuvered, and systematically stripped of everything he claimed to possess. "You cannot do this," Monica whispered, her voice trembling violently. "We have belongings there. We have our lives there." "Your lives were built on stolen capital and fraudulent arrogance," I replied, turning my gaze toward her pale face. "My legal team will oversee the immediate eviction process. You will be allowed to remove your personal clothing and items that were not purchased with embezzled funds. Everything else belongs to my estate, as restitution for the emotional and financial damages you attempted to inflict upon me. You will leave with exactly what you brought into my life, which is absolutely nothing." Derek stared at the floor, his mind desperately searching for a non-existent loophole. He looked up, his face twisted into a mask of pure despair. "What about the people coming for us?" He choked out the words, barely audible. "The syndicate. They are coming to the house today. They are going to kill us, Richard. They do not care about who holds the deed. They only care about the money we owe them." I was begging for my protection, implicitly asking me to shield them from the violent consequences of their own criminal alliances. I stepped back from the island, crossing my arms over my chest. "The syndicate is no longer your primary concern," I informed him, my voice ringing with brutal finality. "I transmitted the complete forensic audit detailing your operations, along with Julian Sterling's offshore routing numbers, directly to the federal authorities yesterday afternoon. The Financial Crimes Division possesses every text message, every transaction log, and every forged document. They are fully aware of the impending physical threat against the Lake Washington property, and they are responding accordingly to secure the perimeter and seize the assets." A faint, piercing wail drifted through the thick glass of my living room windows. The sound originated from the interstate highway, growing steadily louder and more distinct by the second. Derek and Monica froze their heads, snapping toward the front door as the overlapping sirens tore through the quiet morning air. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the wet pavement outside, painting the interior of my foyer in chaotic, pulsing colors. The federal agents and local police were not heading toward the empty lake house. They were converging directly on my address, having tracked the location of their mobile devices. Derek looked at me, his chest heaving, as the sirens reached a deafening crescendo outside my door. He finally understood the absolute totality of his ruin. I had not just outsmarted him. I had orchestrated his complete and inescapable destruction. The heavy wooden door shuddered under a series of sharp, authoritative knocks, cutting through the chaotic aftermath of my revelation. Derek stumbled backward, his eyes darting wildly toward the reinforced glass sidelights framing the entrance. Through the rain-slicked panes, the silhouette of three imposing figures stood waiting on the porch. Two wore tactical jackets bearing the bold yellow letters FBI, while the third was a uniformed officer from the King County Sheriff's Department. They had not arrived casually. They had arrived with tactical precision. I stepped over the scattered documents littering the kitchen floor and unbolted the door, pulling it wide open. The cold morning wind swept inside, carrying the metallic scent of rain and damp asphalt. The lead federal agent, a man with close-cropped gray hair and a rigid posture, stepped onto the threshold. He did not ask for permission to enter. He extended a leather wallet displaying a gleaming silver badge and identified himself as Special Agent Vance from the Financial Crimes Division. Agent Vance bypassed me entirely, his sharp gaze locking onto Derek, who was currently retreating toward the sliding glass doors at the rear of the house. The agent barked a sharp command, ordering my son to halt his movement immediately. The uniformed sheriff unhooked the retention strap on his utility belt, stepping into the foyer with practiced caution. They had evaluated the risk profile of the situation before knocking and were prepared for a desperate suspect attempting a panicked escape. The federal agent produced a folded white document from his tactical vest. He began reading aloud, not rights, but a formal indictment. The charges echoed through my quiet living room with devastating clarity. Aggravated identity theft, first-degree wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud. The bank had not merely frozen the accounts. Sterling Private Wealth's compliance department had transmitted the forged mortgage application directly to the federal prosecutor's office overnight, accelerating the criminal investigation. Monica pressed her back flat against the stainless steel refrigerator, her hands gripping the edge of the granite countertop until her knuckles turned translucent. The agent turned his attention toward her, unrolling a secondary warrant. He formally charged her as a co-conspirator, explicitly citing her digital communications with Julian Sterling and her active participation in the creation of the Delaware Holding Company. Her illusion of being a passive victim evaporated, instantly replaced by the terrifying reality of federal culpability. The sheriff moved decisively, closing the distance between himself and Derek. He instructed my son to place his hands behind his back. Derek offered no physical resistance. His shoulders slumped forward in absolute defeat as the heavy steel cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The metallic sound was incredibly loud in the sudden silence of the room. It was the definitive sound of a life being irrevocably altered, of a gilded existence crashing into the harsh, unforgiving machinery of the criminal justice system. Derek twisted his neck, straining to look at me over his shoulder. His face was a mask of sheer terror, his arrogant demeanor completely shattered. He pleaded with me, his voice cracking under the emotional weight of his impending incarceration. He begged me to tell the agents it was a massive misunderstanding, to explain that we were simply executing a complicated family financial arrangement. He demanded that I drop the charges, insisting that a father could not possibly send his own son to a federal penitentiary. I stood completely still, observing his desperation, with a clinical detachment that surprised even myself. The emotional bonds that once tied me to him had been completely severed by his relentless deceit. I did not raise my voice or offer any display of paternal sorrow. I looked directly into his panicked eyes and delivered the final legal reality he failed to grasp. The state presses charges, Derek Thaw stated, my voice resonating with cold finality. Not me. Agent Vance nodded curtly, confirming my statement. He instructed the sheriff to escort Derek out to the waiting tactical vehicle parked at the end of the driveway. Monica began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving, as the secondary agent approached her with a second pair of handcuffs. She shrieked violently, kicking her legs out in a sudden burst of panicked resistance. The agent calmly maneuvered her arms behind her back, securing the restraints despite her erratic thrashing. The lead agent turned back to me, withdrawing a digital tablet from his jacket. He informed me that my cooperation would be required in the coming weeks. He stated that the forged guarantor form sitting on the kitchen island was a critical piece of evidence. He requested permission to log the document into their immediate chain of custody. I nodded slowly, gesturing toward the leather portfolio containing the remainder of my meticulous investigation. I was handing them the complete architectural blueprints of my son's destruction. The front door remained wide open, the cold morning rain blowing into the foyer, dampening the woven rug where Monica stood paralyzed. As Derek was physically maneuvered toward the waiting tactical vehicle, by the sheriff, Monica's temporary shock shattered, instantly replaced by a frantic, volatile energy. She lunged forward, not to defend her husband, but to aggressively distance herself from him. She grabbed the sleeve of the secondary federal agent, her manicured nails digging into the heavy fabric of his jacket. She shrieked that she was completely innocent, claiming Derek had coerced her into every transaction. Her voice echoed shrilly against the high ceilings, abandoning any pretense of marital loyalty. She spun a chaotic, hysterical narrative, insisting that Derek had controlled the finances with an iron fist and that she was merely a naive, dependent spouse following orders. She aggressively pointed at the forged guarantor form resting on the kitchen island, yelling that Derek had forced her to drive him to my house this morning under the threat of physical violence. She attempted to paint herself as a terrified hostage, completely ignoring her own active communications with Julian Sterling. Derek, hearing her desperate accusations from the porch, halted his progression toward the vehicle. He twisted violently against the sheriff's grip, and his face contorted in absolute disbelief and rage. He screamed back at Monica, his voice raw and ragged, accusing her of initiating the entire scheme. He yelled that the Bahamian cryptocurrency exchange was entirely her idea, brought to him by her manipulative ex-boyfriend. I explicitly detailed how she had drained their savings and demanded the falsified mortgage application to satisfy Julian's extortionate deadlines. The marriage disintegrated spectacularly in the span of 30 seconds, devolving into a vicious public shouting match across the threshold of my home. Monica countered by screaming that Derek was the one who liquidated their son's college fund, a devastating revelation she hoped would secure my sympathy. She dramatically fell to her knees on the damp floorboards, clasping her hands together in a performative prayer. She begged me to tell the agents that she was a good mother, that she had always respected me, a lie so transparent it was almost offensive. Agent Vance stepped between them, his demeanor cold and entirely unmoved by the theatrical display. He instructed the secondary agent to separate the suspects, ordering him to escort Monica to a separate holding vehicle to prevent further collusion or conflict. He bluntly informed Monica that her digital footprint contradicted every single word of her current narrative. He explicitly cited intercepted emails where she enthusiastically authorized the creation of the Delaware Holding Company and coordinated the transfer of stolen funds. Monica's performative tears vanished instantly, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, cornered malice. The realization that her manipulation tactics were entirely ineffective against federal investigators stripped away her final layer of defense. She glared at me, her eyes burning with a sudden, intense hatred, blaming me for exposing her meticulously constructed reality. She hissed that I was a bitter, vindictive old man who enjoyed destroying his own family, a final, venomous attempt to inflict emotional damage before her arrest. I remained completely impassive, refusing to engage with her desperate hostility. I retrieved a thick, sealed envelope from my leather portfolio and handed it directly to Agent Vance. The envelope contained a certified copy of the reverted property deed, processed and stamped by the county recorder late Friday afternoon. I informed the agent that the Lake Washington estate, where they had previously resided, was now legally under my sole and exclusive ownership, triggered by the anti-fraud provisions in the original trust. Agent Vance broke the seal, scanning the official document with practiced efficiency. He nodded, verifying the authenticity of the title transfer. He turned his attention back to Monica, who was now secured in handcuffs by the secondary agent. The agent informed her that her legal residence was no longer the $2.5 million mansion. He stated that due to the asset seizure protocols linked to the federal fraud charges and the immediate reversion of the property deed, she possessed no legal right to inhabit the premises. The agent delivered the final crushing blow with bureaucratic precision. He instructed Monica that upon processing her arrest and securing a potential bail release, she would have exactly 24 hours to vacate the Lake Washington property. He specified that she was permitted to remove only personal clothing and items demonstrably unlinked to the fraudulent funds. Any attempt to remove furniture, electronics, or valuables would be considered a secondary theft of federal evidence and a violation of my property rights. Monica stared at the agent, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled from the water. The absolute totality of her ruin finally registered in her mind. She was not merely facing federal prison time. She was being stripped of her home, her status, and her entire constructed identity in a matter of hours. The luxury vehicles, the custom window treatments, the European oak floors, everything she had valued above human connection was completely gone. She was leaving with exactly nothing. The secondary agent placed a firm hand on Monica's shoulder, guiding her firmly out the door and into the pouring rain. She stumbled slightly on the wet porch, her designer coat rapidly soaking through. She did not look back at me, nor did she look at Derek, who was already secured in the back of the primary tactical vehicle. She walked toward the flashing red and blue lights, a broken, shivering figure, completely isolated by her own insatiable greed and deceit. Agent Vance lingered in the foyer for a moment, securing the certified deed and the forged guarantor form into an evidence bag. He looked at me, a flicker of professional respect crossing his stoic features. He noted that the precision of my documentation had likely saved the Bureau months of investigative work. He confirmed that a federal prosecutor would be in contact within the week to schedule my formal deposition. He nodded curtly, stepped out onto the porch, and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him, plunging my home back into absolute undisturbed silence. I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Thomas Wright's law firm, the air thick with a solemn, purposeful silence. The chaos of the morning's arrests had faded, replaced by the methodical machinery of legal strategy. We weren't drafting defensive maneuvers anymore. We were building an offensive front to secure a vulnerable life. My grandson, currently in the temporary care of Child Protective Services following his parents' apprehension, was the sole remaining priority. I instructed Thomas to initiate an emergency petition for full permanent physical and legal custody. The legal argument was brutally straightforward. Both parents were facing imminent, lengthy federal incarcerations for complex financial crimes involving identity theft and wire fraud. Their home had been seized, their assets frozen, and their moral compasses proven catastrophically defective. Thomas assured me that given my pristine financial standing, stable living environment, and the overwhelming evidence of their criminal negligence, the family court judge would likely expedite the placement. I signed the necessary affidavits, feeling a profound sense of duty, replacing the lingering sting of betrayal. I left the law office and drove directly to the Lake Washington property. The driveway, usually occupied by luxury European sedans, was completely empty. The silence surrounding the estate was different now. It wasn't the tense, manufactured quiet of an ignored text message, but the absolute stillness of reclaimed territory. I had arranged for a specialized locksmith to meet me at the front door. Within 20 minutes, every entry point from the grand double doors to the subtle side gates had its core mechanism replaced and secured with high-grade unpickable tumblers. Walking through the foyer, I surveyed the aggressive perfection of the interior. Monica's desperate attempts at aristocratic living, The imported vases, the minimalist furniture, the pristine European oak floors felt incredibly hollow. It was a museum of fabricated wealth built on a foundation of deception and forged signatures. I made a mental note to hire a staging company the following week. I intended to sell the property quickly, liquidating the memories and utilizing the capital to establish a secure ironclad trust fund exclusively dedicated to my grandson's future education and well-being. I moved through the silent rooms, my footsteps echoing faintly, until I reached the expansive back patio. I pulled one of the teak lounge chairs toward the edge of the deck, facing the dark, rippling expanse of the water. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, fiery streaks of orange and purple across the Seattle skyline. I sat down, feeling the physical exhaustion of the past 48 hours finally settle into my bones, mingling with a sharp, undeniable sense of relief. The amputation of a toxic element from one's life, even when that element is a son, is a brutal, visceral process. It requires cutting through years of conditioned leniency and confronting the terrifying reality of their true nature. Derek and Monica had demanded peace through isolation, intending to utilize that silence to orchestrate my absolute ruin. Instead, I had engineered a counterstrike that legally and financially dismantled their entire fraudulent existence, leaving them with exactly nothing. The house was finally quiet, devoid of arrogant demands, manufactured crises, and the suffocating weight of ungrateful dependence. This silence was not a surrender. It was a conquest. I had dictated the terms of this peace, enforcing absolute accountability upon those who mistook my generosity for weakness. I watched the last sliver of the sun dip below the horizon, understanding that the impending legal battles and custody hearings would be arduous, but I was fully prepared. The clueless old man had vanished, replaced by a guardian who would ensure the next generation was raised with the integrity his son so spectacularly lacked. 3 months had passed since the rain-soaked morning of the arrests, but the final chapter of this nightmare had yet to be written. The federal courtroom in downtown Seattle was freezing the air, thick with the sterile scent of polished wood and nervous sweat. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing my best charcoal suit. Today was the sentencing hearing. My grandson was safely at home with his new nanny, completely shielded from the collapse of his parents' empire. Derek sat at the defense table, shackled at the waist and ankles. He had lost at least 20 pounds. The arrogance that once defined him had been completely hollowed out, replaced by a trembling panic. Beside him sat Monica, refusing to even look in his direction. Julian Sterling, the architect of the scam, sat 2 tables over. He had attempted to secure a plea deal by claiming Derek was the true mastermind. However, the forensic audit I provided had completely neutralized his defense, resulting in his 20-year sentence just moments prior. The federal judge, a stern woman with decades of experience, asked if I wished to read my victim impact statement. I stood up and walked slowly toward the podium. The entire courtroom fell silent. I did not hold a piece of paper. I looked directly at the judge, and then I turned my piercing gaze to my son. I told the court that the financial damage was ultimately irrelevant. The true crime committed in this room was the deliberate assassination of trust. I explained how my son had weaponized my love, how he had utilized my quiet retirement to fabricate a dementia diagnosis, aiming to strip away my fundamental human rights. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute cold clarity of my words echoed off the high ceiling like a gavel strike. Suddenly, Derek snapped. The broken facade shattered completely. He stood up, the heavy steel chains rattling violently against the wooden table, and began screaming across the silent courtroom. He yelled that I had forced him into this desperation, that my expectations were too high, that I had selfishly hoarded my wealth, while he struggled to maintain the demanding lifestyle I had forced upon him. It was a pathetic, desperate outburst, a final attempt to shift his own guilt onto the father who had funded his entire privileged existence. The judge aggressively slammed her wooden gavel, ordering the armed bailiffs to physically restrain him. But I raised my hand, requesting permission to speak one last time. I looked directly at Derek as he was forced back into his chair, panting and flushed with rage. "You did not struggle, Derek," I said softly, the microphone carrying my steady voice to every single corner of the room. "You simply choked on your own insatiable greed. You actively sold your own son's future to a con artist, and you tried to bury your father alive to cover your tracks. Your choices and these consequences belong entirely to you." The judge did not show a single ounce of leniency. She explicitly cited the premeditated nature of the forged conservatorship petition as a severe aggravating factor. She handed down a devastating absolute sentence: 15 years in federal prison for Derek, with no possibility of early parole. Monica, due to her active collusion, received 12. As the bailiffs escorted them toward the heavy holding cells, Derek finally looked back at me. There was no defiance left, only the crushing, terrifying realization of a decade and a half behind bars. I did not offer a comforting nod. I simply turned away and walked out the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, stepping into the bright, crisp Seattle afternoon. The slate was finally wiped completely clean, and my grandson's true life was finally just beginning. Sometimes the most profound act of love a parent can offer is to step back and let the consequences of greed run their natural course. We spend our lives building safety nets for our children, hoping to cushion their falls. But when that net is used to entangle and destroy you, cutting the ropes is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. True peace isn't found by surrendering to disrespect. It is earned by demanding accountability. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, honesty, and respect are what truly make you family. Never compromise your dignity. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more life lessons. Have you ever had to set a painful boundary with a loved one? Let me know in the comments below, along with where you are watching from today.